Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're setting aside sword fights, pestilence, and crumbling castles to look at something a little more everyday, and yet not at all ordinary. We're talking about medieval women, not just queens or damsels, but real people. The ones who ran homes, healed the sick, copied manuscripts, survived childbirth without anesthesia, and somehow still found time to complain about their neighbors. So before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the sleepy little global village we've built. Now, dim the lights. Maybe fluff your pillow or curl up under a suspiciously medieval blanket. And prepare to meet the women of the Middle Ages, not the ones from fairy tales. The ones with calluses, strong opinions, and a very realistic understanding of what it takes to survive when your mattress is made of straw. Let's begin. Let's start simple. You're in a village. Thatched roofs, muddy lanes, the smell of turnips and poultry. Now imagine a house at the edge of the road. Who's running it? If you said the man of the house, think again. Most medieval peasant women didn't just do women's work. They did all the work. Housekeeping, sure, cooking over an open fire, brewing ale, raising kids, but also planting fields, tending animals, mending tools, and occasionally chasing off wolves with a rake. Try doing all that while pregnant in a dress made from the same fabric as your sack of onions. Women also managed the household budget. And by budget, I mean trying to stretch a few coins and some moldy rye into meals, candles, and cloth. If she brewed good ale, she could sell it. If she spun good thread, she might trade it for eggs. In short, peasant women were project managers with chronic back pain. Even legal documents from the time show women buying, selling, even suing. Because if your neighbor's pig trampled your herb garden, medieval or not, someone was going to court. And while we often think of medieval society as strictly patriarchal, and yes, in many ways, it was, at the day-to-day level, many households simply ran because women kept them running. Quiet power, one ladle of stew at a time. Now let's leave the muddy fields and enter a quiet scriptorium. Candles flicker, pages flutter, and there she is, not a monk, but a nun. Writing. Hildegard of Bingen was born in 1098 and sent to a convent before she could spell it. By adulthood, she wasn't just a nun. She was an author, theologian, composer, scientist, and occasional visionary who saw glowing symbols in the sky and decided, yes, I should definitely write this down. And write she did, in Latin, in verse, in music, in medical texts. If she lived today, she'd have a YouTube channel, 3 podcasts, and a line of herbal teas. She wasn't just popular in her own convent. Bishops, popes, and emperors asked for her advice, and she gave it, sometimes very bluntly. She once told a pope he was too passive, and warned an emperor that he was basically terrible at his job. In very elegant medieval Latin, of course. She also wrote about medicine and the female body, in an era when most male scholars thought women's anatomy was either mysterious or probably filled with sin. Hildegard said, actually, here's how it works, and kept writing. Oh, and she composed music. Over 70 original compositions. Think ethereal chants with lyrics like, oh, glowing greenness. So if you've ever fallen asleep to ambient monk music, chances are she helped invent the genre. She didn't need a sword. She had parchment and a backbone. Imagine you're feeling unwell in a medieval village. Maybe it's a cough, maybe your arm's gone purple, maybe you just ate something that looked like a turnip but definitely wasn't. There's no doctor, no clinic, no health insurance, unless you count lighting a candle and hoping for divine intervention. What do? You go see her, the village healer, usually a woman, often older, sometimes called a wise woman, occasionally a cunning woman, and, if things went badly, a witch. But for most of her neighbors, she was simply the one person who actually knew how to help. She didn't go to university. Universities didn't allow women. But she knew herbs. She knew anatomy. And she had an uncanny ability to tell the difference between "you're going to be fine" and "start preparing the funeral bread." These women carried knowledge passed down orally. Recipes, remedies, prayers, and weird little rituals that combined observation with tradition. If your baby wouldn't stop crying, she might suggest fennel tea. If your husband had a boil the size of an apple, she might mash up plantain leaves and bind them with linen. She brewed potions, poultices, and pessimism. Because, let's be honest, sometimes there wasn't much she could do. Still, people came. They brought eggs, cheese, a warm loaf of bread, or just whatever they had. And in exchange, she patched up their injuries, helped women through childbirth, and offered advice on everything from dreams to toothaches. But here's the catch. Being good at this kind of thing was dangerous, especially if you were a woman. If your cures worked too well, people whispered. If they didn't work at all, people whispered louder. She helped my son's fever disappear. Yes, and also the neighbor's chickens stopped laying eggs. Coincidence? Medieval society wasn't known for nuance. Many healers ended their lives under suspicion. During waves of panic, especially plagues or poor harvests, the same women who had been community lifelines suddenly became scapegoats. They were accused of summoning storms, blighting crops, or speaking to cats in suspiciously fluent meows. And yet, for centuries, these women kept healing. Quietly, competently, and with far more success than most people gave them credit for. You want a real medieval hero? Forget knights. Look for the woman with a mortar and pestle, a collection of dried herbs, and a face that says, "Don't waste my time unless you're actually dying." Let's step inside a medieval convent. Not the spooky thunderstorm version from bad historical fiction, but the real one. A high stone wall encircles the property. Bells chime in the distance. Everything smells faintly of beeswax, damp stone, and, if it's a feast day, stewed onions. You're now in a cloister, home to women who've taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These are nuns. And while they may not have families, farms, or Tinder accounts, they do have something few medieval women ever tasted: autonomy. For some, entering a convent was deeply spiritual. They wanted to serve God, renounce the world, and chant psalms in peace. For others, it was a practical matter. Maybe their family couldn't afford a dowry. Maybe they were the fifth daughter in a household of 9. Maybe they just really didn't want to marry the sweaty merchant their uncle had in mind. In the cloister, things were orderly. Days were carved into blocks of prayer, work, study, more prayer, and the occasional silence so heavy it could flatten a goose. Nuns often rose in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. for matins, the first of 7 daily prayer services. Imagine being half asleep, wrapped in scratchy wool, shuffling down a candlelit hallway to chant Latin with other equally sleep-deprived sisters. It was holy. And horrible. Mostly holy. But here's the twist. Convents weren't just sleepy sanctuaries. They were surprisingly busy. Nuns copied books, taught girls to read, ran gardens and bakeries, brewed beer, made medicine, and occasionally ran hospitals. Some wrote treatises on theology or composed music, all while maintaining a strict vow of humility, which they sometimes cleverly ignored. And while silence was required in certain parts of the day, the idea that nuns never talked? A myth. They did talk during recreation time, in sign language, or occasionally behind the abbot's back when the bread was burnt again. There were dramas, petty arguments, forbidden letters. One nun, in a fit of frustration, reportedly climbed a tree and refused to come down until her sewing privileges were restored. Medieval rebellion at its finest. Some convents were stricter than others. The Benedictines were moderate. The Cistercians were practically monastic minimalists. And the poor Claires? Think of them as the medieval equivalent of hardcore minimalists with a strict skincare routine. No meat, no shoes, no speaking out of turn. Despite the rules, many nuns reported deep peace in cloister life, stability, sisterhood, a space to think, read, and, for a rare few, write their thoughts without a man editing the ending. And when death came, they were usually buried right there in the garden, quietly, without fanfare. Just another sister, laid to rest in the earth. She spent her life quietly tilling. So the next time someone says women in the Middle Ages had no choices, tell them about the nun who woke up before dawn, copied 3 books, nursed a sick neighbor, and still made it to Vespers on time, and did it all without once complaining about the draft in her cell. Probably. Now let's trade the cold convent stone for something a little more gilded, but just as dramatic. Imagine velvet tapestries, jeweled goblets, and at least 3 people in the room plotting against you. Welcome to the world of medieval queenship. Specifically, the world of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born around 1122, Eleanor wasn't just a queen, she was a double queen, first of France, then of England. And between those 2 royal jobs, she found time to launch a crusade, spark a cultural revolution, get imprisoned, and raise 10 children, including Richard the Lionheart. That's not a resume. That's a medieval HBO series waiting to happen. Let's start at the beginning. Eleanor inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine as a teenager, a region so large and wealthy it made the French crown look like a lemonade stand. She married Louis VII of France shortly after, because medieval matchmaking wasn't about love, it was about land. And wow, did she have land. But Louis was, well, let's say he was more monk than monarch. He liked long prayers, boring clothes, and pilgrimages. Eleanor, on the other hand, preferred poetry, music, and the occasional witty insult. Their marriage hit turbulence, especially during the Second Crusade, which they both joined. Picture a royal couple leading separate military camps across the Middle East, arguing about strategy and whether her soldiers were too fashionable. It did not go well. Eventually, the Pope granted them an annulment. Eleanor then married Henry Plantagenet, who soon became King Henry II of England. And this time, sparks flew both metaphorically and literally. Their early years were passionate and politically electric. She ruled parts of France, advised Henry, and promoted art and culture, especially the idea of courtly love, a medieval concept that gave romance a PR makeover involving knights, longing glances, and poetry no one really understood. But power is a tricky thing. As Henry grew more controlling, Eleanor pushed back. When her sons revolted against him, she allegedly supported them. Henry, unsurprisingly, was not thrilled. His solution? He imprisoned her for 16 years. Let that sink in. A queen. One of the most powerful women in Europe. Locked away, not in a dungeon, but in a series of castles. Which honestly still counts as medieval prison if the windows are small and the wine is bad. But Eleanor wasn't done. After Henry died, she was released and immediately went back to running the kingdom on behalf of her son, Richard the Lionheart, who, being a typical royal child, promptly left for the Crusades and got himself imprisoned. Eleanor, at nearly 70, rode across Europe negotiating his ransom, writing letters, and generally outmaneuvering every man who had ever underestimated her. She died at age 82, a stunning age for the time, having spent her life navigating war, scandal, power, motherhood, imprisonment, and more than one dramatic family dinner. So yes, some medieval women were queens in title. But Eleanor? She was a queen in strategy. She didn't just survive the medieval world. She manipulated it, mothered it, and, on a few notable occasions, reminded it that underestimating her was a terrible idea. When you picture a medieval battlefield, your mind likely conjures up a long line of men in chainmail, hoisting spears, shouting in Old French, and dramatically dying in mud. What you probably don't imagine. A woman in armor, not holding a banner, not cheering from the sidelines, but fighting, and yet they existed. Women who put on helmets, picked up swords, and walked onto actual battlefields with all the grace of someone who definitely didn't ask permission. Now let's be clear. Medieval society didn't encourage this. Women weren't supposed to fight. They were supposed to stay behind, pray, and, if the siege lasted long enough, throw boiling water from the parapets. But rules in the Middle Ages were like medieval roofs, full of holes, and ignored during emergencies. Let's start with one of the most famous, Joan of Arc. Born in 1412 in Domremy, France, Joan was a peasant girl with no education, no military training, and a suspicious habit of hearing voices. Those voices, she claimed, were from saints, urging her to save France during the 100 Years' War. So what did she do? She walked straight into history. At just 17, she met the future King of France, convinced him she was legit, and was handed an army. An army. And the wild part? She won battles. Dressed in white armor, riding into combat, directing troops. Not watching. Not whispering advice. Leading. Joan helped lift the siege of Orléans, a turning point in the war. Soldiers followed her. Nobles backed her. Chroniclers were baffled. Of course, this terrified people. A woman? In armor? Giving orders? That was fine if you were a saint. But as soon as politics got involved, Joan was in trouble. She was captured by the English, put on trial for heresy, or more accurately, for wearing men's clothing and being inconvenient, and burned at the stake in 1431. She was 19. Later, the church decided she was a martyr. Convenient. But Joan wasn't the only one. There was Nicola de la Haye, who defended Lincoln Castle in England, twice in her 60s, not as a figurehead, as Castellan. She held off sieges, negotiated terms, and probably sighed a lot at the incompetence of male commanders. Or Jean Hachette, who helped repel an invading force in Beauvais, France, by grabbing a standard and leading a counterattack so fierce the enemy fled. The town celebrated her bravery with a parade, and to this day they still do. And then there were the unnamed women, the ones who picked up weapons when their towns were under attack, who manned the walls, swung axes, patched wounds between sword swings, and made the sensible decision to fight when running wasn't an option. Because that's the thing. Medieval women were told to be obedient, modest, and quiet. But in times of war, they were also resourceful, brutal, and very good at improvising. They fought for their homes, their children, their cities, not because they had something to prove, but because, frankly, someone had to. So next time you imagine a medieval battlefield, picture the knight. Yes, but also picture the woman beside him, muddy, angry, and about to ruin your entire afternoon with a well-aimed rock. So you're a woman in the Middle Ages. You've survived your childhood, dodged the plague, possibly avoided marriage or powered through it. You've read all the moral instruction books, each one written by a man, all saying the same thing. Be quiet, be humble, and maybe stop having opinions. And then along comes Christine de Pizan, who takes a long look at all those men and says very politely, "No, thank you." Born in Venice in 1364, Christine moved to Paris as a child when her father became court astrologer to the French king. She was educated, rare enough, and fluent in Latin, philosophy, and crucially sarcasm. She married young, as most did, and by her mid-20s, she was widowed with 3 kids, a niece, a mother to support, and no income. Most women in her position would have remarried or begged. Christine did something else. She wrote, not just love poems or diary entries. She wrote political treatises, biographies, epic poems, and full-blown attacks on the misogyny of her time, all while running a household and chasing toddlers. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, is basically medieval feminist fan fiction, where she builds an imaginary city populated entirely by history's most intelligent, virtuous, and brave women. Each chapter begins with Christine being bombarded by the writings of men, monks, philosophers, poets, all claiming that women are weak, foolish, or dangerous. She responds not by ranting, well, not loudly, but by calmly demolishing their arguments with logic, examples, and a solid grasp of history. She champions women like Sappho, Queen Semiramis, and even the Virgin Mary, presenting them not as passive figures, but as powerful agents of change. She asks, if women are so terrible, why do they keep giving birth to all these men? Christine wasn't just clever, she was successful. She made a living as a professional writer, possibly the first woman in Europe to do so. Royals hired her. Nobles read her. Her books were copied, collected, and preserved, not just because they were good, but because she was too good to ignore. And let's not forget, this was during the 100 Years, War, the Black Death, and repeated waves of political instability. Christine kept writing, even as Paris fell apart around her. She even penned a poem praising Joan of Arc, the only known contemporary writer to do so, calling her a symbol of hope and courage at a time when everything else felt like damp chaos. Christine eventually retired to a convent, not to be quiet, but because even literary legends need a break. She died around 1430, and her works continued to circulate for centuries. In a world where women weren't supposed to speak, Christine wrote loudly, intelligently, and beautifully. She didn't burn down the system. She out-argued it, line by line, until it had to sit down and listen. And if that's not a mic drop in medieval terms, I don't know what is. The medieval court, a swirling maze of velvet robes, wine-stained gossip, bored nobles, and at least one falcon that's always slightly too close to the soup. It was also a place where power was supposedly held by men, kings, dukes, bishops, with questionable haircuts. But look a little closer, and you'll see another set of hands quietly pulling strings. The women behind the thrones. These weren't always queens or regents. Some were duchesses, countesses, or simply well-married women with excellent timing and the patience to pretend they weren't the smartest person in the room. While the king jousted or declared war on a neighboring cousin for looking at him funny, these women handled the real power moves: land negotiations, marriage alliances, inheritance disputes, and the subtle but deadly game of court gossip. Let's talk about Blanche of Castile. She was the mother of King Louis IX of France, and basically ran France while he was busy crusading, fasting, and trying not to get captured, which he did, twice. Blanche wasn't just a placeholder regent. She negotiated treaties, raised armies, and squashed rebellions, once by showing up to a city wall and saying in royal terms, "I dare you." She kept the nobility in check with letters, threats, and the occasional bribery, all while maintaining a pious, motherly image. And her son? He became a saint. Which is impressive, but let's be honest, she ran the place. Or how about Isabella of France, who got tired of her husband Edward II's terrible policies and even worse boyfriends? So she marched into England with an army, overthrew him, and installed her teenage son as king. They called her the She-Wolf of France, which sounds insulting, but honestly, metal. Then there's Margaret of Anjou, who ruled England during the Wars of the Roses while her husband, Henry VI, struggled with mental illness. She led armies. She gave speeches. She forged alliances and scared grown men at court with nothing but a glance and some very expensive rings. Her enemies said she was too ambitious, which is medieval for "she keeps winning and we're annoyed." What made these women powerful wasn't brute force. It was knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to arrange a marriage that just happened to result in someone inheriting a very nice castle. In a world where bloodlines meant everything, they understood that controlling marriages was as good as controlling armies. They also mastered court performance, the fan flutter, The bowed head, the knowing look. Imagine Game of Thrones, but with less dragons and more strategic embroidery. And while they were often written off in chronicles as interfering, ambitious, or the classic unnaturally political, they knew exactly what they were doing. They had to. One wrong word, one misplaced alliance, and their families, or their necks, were on the line. So next time someone says, behind every great man is a great woman, correct them. In the Middle Ages, she wasn't behind him. She was sitting beside him at court, calmly ruining his rival's chances with a forged letter and a smile that said, "Try me. Let's step away from queens and warriors for a moment and talk about something quieter, and in many ways more mysterious." What was it like to grow up as a girl in the Middle Ages? Short answer: confusing, brief, and very, very drafty. From the moment a baby was born, its entire future could shift depending on one thing: gender. A male child might be destined for guilds, land, letters, or warfare. A girl, marriage, motherhood, or a monastery. Occasionally, all three, and not necessarily in that order. Infancy was a roll of the dice. Up to 30% of children didn't survive past age 5. But if you did make it, congratulations. You were now part of the medieval daycare system, also known as your older siblings and whoever wasn't currently chasing pigs. Girls were often swaddled tightly for the first few months, then bundled into simple shifts and taught the basics of survival. How to stir porridge, feed chickens, and not eat things that looked fun but were actually poison. Toys? Sure, but think less wooden castle playset and more pebble I found by the ditch. Dolls were homemade, bundles of cloth with drawn-on faces, sometimes wearing tiny shifts or wimples. Girls also played imitation games, mimicking mothers, baking, weaving, scolding imaginary husbands, training for the future, disguised as fun. Education was rare, but not unheard of. In noble households, girls might learn reading, embroidery, music, and the art of being interesting without being threatening. In wealthier towns, some girls attended grammar schools or learned to keep shop accounts, but the average peasant girl, her lessons were in butter churning and how to walk barefoot across a frozen yard without crying. And then came adolescence, which in the Middle Ages could arrive at 12, not just biologically, but legally. Girls could be married at 12, not betrothed, married. Because once a girl reached what they charmingly called marriageable age, her womb became a topic of public interest. Romantic, right? Marriage wasn't always immediate, though. Families, especially noble ones, played the long game, negotiating alliances through their daughters like living chess pieces. Daughters were rarely asked what they wanted. The ideal bride was obedient, fertile, and came with a decent dowry or a politically useful uncle. That said, not all girls were passive. Some rebelled, resisted, or in rare, glorious cases, ran away to convents where they could read, write, and avoid a husband with bad breath and worse hygiene. And in towns and cities, girls worked. They apprenticed as seamstresses, helped run taverns, acted in pageants, or joined the booming world of medieval brewing. Yes, alewives were often women. They made money, made trouble, and occasionally made history, even if no one wrote it down. Most medieval girls lived lives of labor, laughter, and low expectations. But within that world, they carved out moments of joy, creativity, and resistance. They sang songs while grinding grain. They whispered secrets while mending tunics. They imagined better lives, or, failing that, better porridge. Girlhood wasn't easy. It wasn't long, but it was real. And it shaped the women who, quietly and fiercely, kept the medieval world spinning. Let's take a deep breath and talk about something medieval chroniclers barely mentioned. And when they did, they got it hilariously wrong. Menstruation. Yes, we're going there. Because while kings were busy invading things and monks were inventing cheese-based penance, half the population was quietly dealing with a recurring biological reality using whatever was lying around. First off, there were no tampons, no pads, no heating pads, no sympathetic partners fetching chocolate, and definitely no TikTok videos normalizing cramps. So what did medieval women do? The short answer, they improvised. In many parts of Europe, women used rags, hence the old phrase, on the rag. These were folded pieces of linen or wool, sometimes held in place with string, belts, or even handmade cloth underpants. Think of it like a medieval diaper crossed with an origami puzzle, minus the instructions. Washing these rags was, of course, essential. But water access wasn't great, and soap could be expensive. So, infections happened. Peasant women, especially in warmer months, often didn't use anything at all. They simply bled into their shifts and kept working. These shifts, made of undyed linen, were long, loose, and, unfortunately for hygiene, shared with the rest of the family laundry. Sorry, cousin. And then there's moss. Yes, moss. In some regions, soft absorbent moss was used as a kind of natural pad. It sounds absurd until you realize moss is antibacterial, biodegradable, and free. It might have been the most eco-friendly solution until the 21st century. In colder climates, women sometimes stuffed wool or straw into their underlayers. Again, not ideal. But when you live in a one-room cottage with goats, a lice problem, and a fire that won't stay lit, comfort is a luxury you gave up 3 kings ago. Medical texts written by men had, let's say, creative ideas about menstruation. Some believed that women's bodies needed to purge blood monthly, or their brains would overheat. Others said menstrual blood was poisonous, capable of wilting crops, rusting mirrors, and driving dogs mad, which, to be fair, does sound like a pretty cool superpower. The church wasn't much help either. Some theologians considered menstruation a sign of Eve's sin, which meant a woman on her period was technically impure and shouldn't touch holy objects or receive communion. Others were more chill about it, mostly because they didn't want to talk about it at all. There were also remedies. Crampy? Try sage tea. Overdue period? Drink boiled rue. Bleeding too much? Pray to Saint Margaret and sit on a cold rock. No, seriously. And let's not forget pregnancy. With no reliable contraception, every period brought both relief and disappointment. And when the blood didn't come, things got complicated. Fast. But that's a whole other saga. So yes, medieval women menstruated monthly, painfully, quietly, and without any of the modern conveniences we take for granted. But they got on with it. They cooked, they farmed, they taught, they prayed, and they absolutely did not let it stop them from running an entire household while bleeding into moss. Resilient? Absolutely. Underappreciated? Without question. Just don't let anyone tell you medieval women were delicate flowers. They were, at minimum, a bit thorny and extremely resourceful. Let's end the night by stepping into the shadowy corners of medieval society. The places where women who didn't quite fit the mold were filed away under a single catch-all label, dangerous. Because in a world where obedience was a virtue and silence was golden, it didn't take much to get yourself labeled a bad woman. Start with widows. You'd think people might pity them. After all, they'd lost their husbands, possibly to war, plague, or an ill-advised chicken duel. But no, widows were often viewed with suspicion. Why? Because they had something rare in the medieval world. Freedom. Widows could own property, run businesses, refuse remarriage, wear black and raise eyebrows. Some became moneylenders, alewives, or midwives, all respectable jobs. But throw in a bad harvest, a few too many cats and one sick neighbor, and suddenly you're a witch. Speaking of witches, the medieval concept of witchcraft was, at first, murky. For much of the early Middle Ages, the church didn't even believe in witchcraft. Sorcery? Sure. But old women muttering over herbs? Harmless. Then came the 14th and 15th centuries, a period of plagues, war, famine, and naturally, someone to blame. Enter the witch hunts. Women, usually older, poor, unmarried, or widowed, were accused of causing storms, spoiling milk, cursing neighbors, or dancing with the devil in the woods. Sometimes all of the above. Evidence? A birthmark, a bad attitude, or the crime of being disliked by someone with a grudge and spare ink. And then there were the loud women, the scolds, the shrews, women who gossiped too much, laughed too loudly, or dared to criticize their husbands in public could be punished with the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a tongue press that made speaking impossible. Basically, a medieval mute button for inconvenient wives. The punishment wasn't secretive. It was public humiliation, a parade through town, bells attached to the mask, crowds jeering. A reminder to all women, be quiet or be next. Even fashion could get you judged. A woman who wore red? Seductive. Wore it and walked alone at night? Definitely a prostitute. Wore it, walked alone, and could read? Might as well pack for the stake. Some women leaned into it. Tavern keepers who insulted customers. Midwives who used banned herbs. Dancers who didn't stop when the music did. They knew the risks, and they did it anyway. Because sometimes being labeled bad just meant refusing to be invisible. But here's the twist. These bad women were often the most important ones in their communities. The healers, the storytellers, the caretakers, the survivors. And yes, sometimes the rabble-rousers. History didn't always write their names down, but it remembered their shadows and how those shadows made everyone a little nervous. So next time you hear about a medieval woman punished for being too much, remember, too loud, too clever, too old, too unmarried. These weren't sins. They were survival strategies. And sometimes, being called dangerous was just a side effect of living honestly. So here we are, at the end of our medieval journey, past the cloisters and castles, through blood, moss, politics, and parchment. And what have we learned? That history doesn't always record its most important characters. Because while kings made proclamations and knights rode into battle, it was the women, quiet, clever, often barefoot, who held the world together with thread, dough, and sheer, exhausted willpower. They were everywhere, in the fields, turning soil and gossiping between rows of cabbage, in kitchens, where alchemy and cooking blurred into one long, steamy experiment. In marketplaces, haggling, weighing, whispering deals behind baskets of onions. In convents, copying scripture and sneaking personal notes into the margins. They were midwives delivering babies with hands steadier than any surgeons. They were washerwomen and weavers, beer brewers and bakers, all working long hours to keep their families fed and alive, usually in the same room as the livestock. They lived with constant reminders of their place. The church told them to be humble. The law reminded them they were someone's property. The poets blessed them, described them as either saints or temptresses, with little in between. But despite all this, medieval women were not passive figures drifting through a man's world. They navigated it, adapted to it, outsmarted it, sometimes quietly, sometimes spectacularly. They taught their daughters how to sew, how to survive, how to laugh at men when their backs were turned. They passed on songs, recipes, superstitions, and stubbornness. And every time a chronicler decided not to write their names down, they just kept going. Were they always noble or heroic? No. Some were harsh, some cruel. Some were just as complicit in upholding the unfair systems around them. They were, in short, people full flawed, and fascinating. And in the silence between the grand events of history, you can still hear them. Whispering advice in candlelit kitchens, singing to restless children, bargaining over radishes, arguing over who gets to use the one decent comb in the house. The Middle Ages were muddy, brutal, and often absurd. But they were never boring. And neither were the women who lived them. Not the saints, not the scolds, not the mothers, not the maidens. They were the background, until you realize they were the foundation. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, for every knight in a saga, there was a woman sewing his banners. For every king in a chronicle, a mother who taught him to speak. And for every faded name in a dusty record book, there was someone who deserved to be remembered, and probably would have had a lot to say about all this if only anyone had asked. Sleep well. History has plenty more stories to tell. Let's talk about beauty. Specifically, medieval beauty standards and the women who, with no Sephora, no Pinterest, and definitely no indoor plumbing, still found ways to put their best face forward, or at least not smell like goats. First, the ideal. In most of medieval Europe, the standard of female beauty was heavily inspired by religious imagery, noble portraiture, and the occasional hallucination brought on by bad wine. The perfect woman had pale skin, tiny features, a high forehead, blonde or light brown hair, and eyes that seemed constantly on the verge of swooning, ideally from grace, not anemia. But here's the thing. Most of these features were not natural. They were performed. Let's start with the forehead. High foreheads were all the rage from the 13th to 15th centuries. Women would pluck their hairlines to make their foreheads look taller. Yes, you read that correctly. Some even used razors or pumice stones. The result? A dome-like forehead that screamed pious and fashionable, even if it also whispered, "I regret this decision." Eyebrows? Optional. Many women removed them completely or shaped them into thin lines. The goal was to make your face look gentle, otherworldly, and, frankly, a little bit haunted. As for hair, blondes were preferred. If you weren't born with golden locks, you could bleach them using a mixture of saffron, lye, and sunshine, a medieval DIY project that sounds like a recipe for disaster and eye damage. Hair was rarely worn loose. It was braided, wrapped, hidden under veils, or twisted into shapes that could rival modern origami. And then there was skin. Pale skin meant wealth. It suggested you weren't toiling in the sun, which was clearly peasant behavior. So women used lead-based powders, crushed pearls, ground alabaster, or chalk to whiten their complexions. All of these were mildly to wildly toxic. But beauty is pain, especially if it slowly poisons you over time. Want some color? Lips and cheeks could be tinted with beetroot, madder root, or even crushed insects. But subtly, too much color made you look like you worked in a brothel, and while brothels were legally tolerated in many towns, no one wanted to look like they were familiar with the menu. And now we arrive at smell. Bathing was inconsistent. Contrary to myth, people did bathe in the Middle Ages, but not daily. Women might visit a public bathhouse once a week, or simply sponge off at home using warm water and herbs. Scented sachets were popular. Little pouches of lavender, rosemary, or cloves tucked into sleeves or pinned to undergarments to cover up the distinct aroma of "I live with a pig" toothpaste. Sort of. Women used cloth to rub their teeth with salt, charcoal, or crushed mint. Brushes made from boar bristles existed but were rare, and toothpaste was less minty fresh and more gritty medieval exfoliation. Let's not forget makeup taboos. Church leaders warned against vanity. They claimed makeup was deceptive, a gateway to sin, and, in one delightful sermon, accused women of painting their faces to look like devils at the Feast of Pride. And yet, women kept applying rouge with fingertips and blotting their cheeks with damp cloths, because guess what? They liked it. For many, beauty wasn't about seduction or scandal. It was about pride, ritual, and asserting some tiny measure of control in a world that constantly told them what they couldn't be. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't wear trousers, but they could mix herbs to soften their skin, pluck their foreheads until they looked like marble statues, and walk into church looking absolutely ethereal, even if they just wrestled a goat that morning. So yes, medieval beauty was strange, sometimes dangerous, occasionally absurd. But it was also powerful, and when the candles flickered and the last bit of lye-scrubbed hair fell to the floor, some woman probably looked into her polished copper mirror, winked at her reflection and thought, "Not bad, considering I live in a drafty wooden cube. Let's dim the torches and talk about romance. The fluttery, heart-skipping kind. Or at least the medieval version of it, which involved more poetry, less privacy, and a lot of anxiety about dowries. For medieval women, love was rarely just about feelings. It was economics, politics, inheritance law, and a high-stakes gamble where you had very little say. Marriages were usually arranged, not by the couple, but by parents, uncles, or whoever had the family seal. Love was optional. Land was not. But that doesn't mean romance didn't exist. It just had to be creative. Let's begin with courtly love, the knight and lady dynamic popularized in the 12th century. Picture this: a noblewoman in a tower, a bored knight who just got back from crusading, and an entire library of poems describing how much he loves her but definitely can't touch her. Courtly love was a socially acceptable outlet for desire, full of longing glances, tortured metaphors, and declarations of eternal devotion, all without removing anyone's hose. Women, especially noble women, often received these poems with polite amusement or careful silence. Some engaged in flirtation. A few responded in kind. One noblewoman in France was known for writing back with verses that roasted her suitors for their bad rhyme schemes. And some took it further. Affairs happened, discreetly, dangerously, and sometimes disastrously. Love letters were exchanged via servants, hidden in embroidery or books. In one 14th century scandal, a married lady smuggled notes to a monk using hollowed-out loaves of bread. It worked until someone got hungry and very confused. But beyond the elite circles, what did romance look like? For peasant women, love was practical. If you were lucky, you married someone from your village, someone you knew. Courtship could involve gifts, cheese, ribbons, eggs, songs sung outside windows, or awkward dances at festivals. A kiss might be scandalous. Premarital intimacy? Common. Church rules forbade it, but reality often ignored those rules, especially during harvest season, when wine was flowing and haystacks were very convenient. And yet, love wasn't powerless. Records show couples eloping against family wishes, especially when social status or money got in the way. Some communities tolerated hand fasting, informal betrothal ceremonies that weren't quite legal marriages but were emotionally binding. Think of it as medieval engagement, with slightly more goats present, but women took risks, falling for the wrong man. A servant, a foreigner, a priest could mean exile, scandal, or worse. And let's not even talk about falling for another woman. That was usually ignored, punished, or turned into an awkward chapter in a monk's diary. Still, love had its defenders. Christine de Pizan, our literary heroine, argued that true love based on mutual respect and intellect was not only real, but preferable. Imagine saying that in the 1400s, bold. And of course there were the dreams. Medieval women wrote letters, sang songs, or embroidered initials into cloth, small acts of longing in a world that didn't always allow them to speak freely. A noblewoman in England once requested a poem to be written for no one in particular, but asked that it include a secret phrase her lover would understand. Smooth. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't simple. It was stitched together from longing, duty, rebellion, and hope. Sometimes it bloomed quietly in locked gardens. Sometimes it ended in heartbreak and a lot of Latin paperwork. But whether whispered at a feast, written in ink, or sung beneath a window, it existed fiercely, secretly, and beautifully, even in a world where almost everything was forbidden. If you think modern motherhood is tough, midnight feedings, strange advice from strangers, and an ever-growing pile of laundry, try adding wolves, plague, and the church's opinion on your womb. Welcome to medieval motherhood, a role both revered and relentlessly exhausting. First, let's get one thing straight. Motherhood wasn't just expected, it was required. A woman's value, spiritually, legally, even socially, was often tied to her ability to produce healthy sons. Daughters were fine, too, especially if they could marry well or be sent off to a convent to make room. But sons? Sons meant security, inheritance, and bragging rights. But getting to that point was a lot. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages came with excitement, fear, and superstition. Lots of it. Women believed that what they looked at, ate, or even thought about could affect the baby. If you gazed too long at something ugly, you might mark the child. If you craved fish too often, you were warned your baby might come out slippery. And no, I'm not making that up. There were midwives, of course, trained, and usually older, women who assisted with deliveries. Some were brilliant. Others were simply experienced. Many had learned their craft through dozens of births, whispered advice, and the occasional emergency involving a candle, a prayer, and a very nervous goat. Midwives were often trusted more than doctors, especially since most male physicians had never seen a woman's body and based their knowledge on Roman texts, personal guesses, and occasional dreams about Galen. When labor came, the birthing chamber would be closed off. No men allowed. Tapestries were hung, icons placed on the walls, incense burned, and prayers whispered. It was sacred. It was sweaty. It was risky. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. There were no epidurals, no antiseptic tools, and no concept of germ theory. Complications like breech births, hemorrhages, or infections often proved fatal, which is why saints like Margaret of Antioch were so popular. She was the medieval patron saint of childbirth. Women wore her image on belts, sang her name during contractions, and sometimes engraved her prayers onto rings. If the baby survived, and that wasn't guaranteed, the next challenge was keeping it alive. Infant mortality was high. Many children didn't live past their 5th birthday. So mothers became experts in practical magic, swaddling, nursing, herbal teas, lullabies, and protective charms. Babies were wrapped tightly in linen bands, not just for warmth, but to encourage proper limb development and keep them still while mom went to tend the sheep. Breastfeeding was expected, though noble women sometimes hired wet nurses. This created its own mess of social commentary, suspicion, and poetic whining about the pure bond between mother and child being outsourced to someone with a better milk supply. To soothe the child, mothers used lullabies, simple, repetitive songs, often in the local dialect, blending religious comfort with daily complaints. Some survive in medieval manuscripts. One, translated from Middle English, includes a line that basically says, "Go to sleep now, or I'll leave you in the woods." Spoken with love, of course. And then there was motherly advice, passed from grandmother to daughter, from neighbor to friend. Some of it was brilliant. Keep the baby warm but not sweaty. Some, less so. To cure colic, rub the baby with warmed goose fat while reciting a psalm backward. But motherhood wasn't just domestic. Mothers also managed. They ran households, trained children in chores, negotiated marriages, and in many cases, passed down property or family trades. A peasant mother might teach her daughter how to spin and her son how to bait a fishing line, all while baking bread and grinding flour with her foot. And yes, they mourned. Child loss was so common it barely registered in legal records, but it cut just as deep. Women wore tokens of lost children, prayed for them, named the next child after them, grieved in silence, because grief wasn't always considered a public act for women. So medieval motherhood was hard, beautiful, terrifying, messy, holy, lonely, and occasionally hilarious. And when the kids were finally asleep, the stew was simmering, and the fire had been poked back to life, some woman somewhere likely looked down at the bundle in her lap and thought, "Please don't wake up before dawn. I love you, but please, just this once." When you think of medieval education, you might picture monks copying texts in drafty scriptoria, or young boys learning Latin in echoing halls while dodging well-aimed sticks. And you'd be mostly right. But what about the girls? What about the quiet, ink-smudged figures in the corners of manuscripts? The ones who weren't supposed to be writing but did anyway? Who learned to read between the lines, literally and figuratively? Because yes, medieval women did learn. Not always, not often, and rarely with permission. But when they did, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Let's begin with the basics. Formal education for girls was limited. Universities were closed to them. Monasteries taught only boys. And most grammar schools, those rare institutions that trained children in reading, writing, and ecclesiastical Latin, excluded females entirely. The reasoning was simple. Women didn't need education to fulfill their natural roles, which is odd, considering how much of medieval society depended on women being able to manage things, land, businesses, children, and occasionally their own rebellious husbands. So how did women learn? If you were noble, you had a chance. Girls in aristocratic households were sometimes educated alongside brothers, especially if their fathers were progressive or absent. They learned to read, often in French or their local dialect, and sometimes Latin. They were taught to compose letters, read romances, calculate household accounts, and recite prayers. And if they were lucky, they got access to books. Books were luxury items, hand-copied, labor-intensive, and expensive. But noblewomen often owned them. Prayer books, romances, bestiaries, herbal guides. Some even commissioned their own. The Hours of Jeanne d'Evreux, a 14th century prayer book, was made for a queen and includes tiny, detailed marginalia that suggest a sense of humor. Rabbits jousting, nuns chasing geese, maybe a wink from the artist, or maybe from the woman who paid him. But education wasn't limited to nobility. In towns, merchant and artisan families sometimes sent daughters to learn basic literacy, enough to run a business, read correspondence, or keep track of debts. Girls learned to write names, tally costs, and sometimes even pen letters. Some became scribes, copying texts for local clerics or guilds. And then there were the convents. Convents were the medieval equivalent of women's colleges. Nuns didn't just pray. They read, wrote, and copied manuscripts. Some wrote music, theology, or philosophy. The most famous example, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who composed symphonies, wrote medical treatises, and corresponded with emperors, all in Latin. In fact, we now know that female scribes were more common than previously thought. One study analyzed the dental remains of a medieval nun and found traces of lapis lazuli, a rare blue pigment used in illuminated manuscripts, embedded in her teeth. She'd likely been licking her brush. Which means, yes, she was probably painting illuminated texts, with blue made from crushed gemstones. So why don't we hear more about these women? Because many signed their work anonymously, or their names were scrubbed out over time. Chroniclers didn't think women's writing was worth preserving, unless it was scandalous or saintly. The rest got lost in attic trunks and worm-eaten pages. And still, they wrote. Some women kept personal prayer books filled with marginal notes, birth dates, dreams, confessions. Others scribbled names into the backs of pages or stitched verses into embroidery. Some even carved their initials into wooden beams. Not quite a diary, but close. There were women who wrote poems to lost lovers, and those who copied recipes with tiny annotations. Add more salt. Last time it was awful. Practical and poetic, all at once. So no, most medieval women weren't formally educated, but they learned in kitchens, in gardens, at convent desks, and beside sickbeds. They learned in whispers and with stolen ink. They taught their daughters the alphabet while teaching them to spin. They read psalms aloud and memorized verses by candlelight, even when their brothers got the books and they got the broom. They weren't allowed to change the curriculum, so they made their own. Let's throw open the market gates and step into the noisy, colorful, occasionally fish-scented world of medieval commerce. Bells are ringing, donkeys are braying. Someone's trying to sell you a questionable pie. And over there, behind the counter, is a woman counting coins like her life depends on it, because often it did. While history loves to paint medieval women as quiet, domestic figures, spinning in corners and tending to soup, the truth is that many were hustlers. Not in the modern #inspirational sense, but in the original mud on your boots, barter until you win sense. They worked. A lot. And not just for their families. For profit. Let's start with one of the most iconic roles, the alewife. Ale, not water, was the medieval drink of choice. It was safer, tastier, and came in mildly tipsy, or this will knock you out. Brewing ale was a domestic task, but clever women turned it into a business. Alewives brewed in their homes, hung a broom or ale stick above the door, the original pub sign, and sold mugs to neighbors, travelers, and anyone with a coin. Some alewives made good money. Others were accused of watering down their product or overcharging. A few even made it into satire poems, painted as greedy, rowdy, or suspiciously independent. But beneath the mockery was a truth. These women had economic power, and in many cases, more customers than the men. Then there were the market women. They sold bread, cheese, eggs, vegetables, fish, herbs, linen, whatever they could grow, make, or haggle for. Many had regular stalls or barrows. Others walked through town calling out their goods in rhyming sales pitches. 3 fresh eels for a halfpenny was the medieval equivalent of 2 for 1 avocado toast. And they weren't just passive sellers. Women set prices, negotiated bulk deals, and, when needed, took their disputes to court. In fact, medieval legal records are full of women suing over unpaid debts, broken contracts, or stolen goods. They knew the rules and how to bend them. In cities like London, Paris, and Bruges, women ran shops. Seamstresses, weavers, hat makers, candle makers, glove makers, herbalists, bakers, wool merchants. Some worked under their husband's name, but many, especially widows, operated independently. Widows had a unique advantage. Unlike married women, they weren't legally tied to their husband's status. That meant they could own property, sign contracts, and pay taxes in their own name. Some became formidable. One widow in York ran a wool business that rivaled local guilds. Another in Florence loaned money to nobles with interest. In fact, female moneylenders were common, especially in Jewish communities where women often handled household finances. Christian women, too, found loopholes, lending gifts with thank you tokens, or arranging exchanges that looked suspiciously like loans but weren't, at least not legally. Women also worked as servants, midwives, innkeepers, laundresses, spinners, and scribes. Some joined craft guilds, rare but not unheard of. A few even founded them. And let's not forget the informal economy. Women rented out rooms, sold secondhand goods, acted as matchmakers, and brewed herbal tonics. They earned coins in back alleys and behind curtain stalls. They made things work. Of course, it wasn't all empowerment and prosperity. Women faced restrictions, taxes, guild exclusions, and societal backlash. Some cities limited how much a woman could earn. Others forbade them from selling certain male goods, like swords or saddles, because nothing says fragile masculinity like a lady selling you a scabbard. But they found ways around it, through family networks, through clever partnerships, through sheer persistence. So while the history books often celebrate kings and knights, the medieval towns ran on the backs of women who could calculate change, spot a bad apple, and sell you something you didn't know you needed. And if that's not power, I don't know what is. Close your eyes and imagine the faint scent of beeswax candles, the echo of Gregorian chants, the cool hush of stone underfoot. Welcome to the sacred world, not of bishops and monks, but of women whose faith ran deeper than doctrine and stranger than legend. Because when it came to religion in the Middle Ages, women weren't just kneeling in pews. They were seeing visions, founding convents, smuggling relics, fasting themselves into trances, and occasionally being accused of heresy for asking too many excellent questions. Let's begin with the basics. Religion was everywhere. It governed time via feast days, weather via saints, sickness via sin, and basically all human behavior. For women, faith was both a comfort and a cage. The church taught that women were spiritually weaker, more prone to temptation, more burdened by Eve's sin, and best kept obedient. And yet, medieval Christianity offered women space to shape their own identities, communities, and even rebellions. One of the most powerful options was the convent. Not a prison, as it's often depicted, but a place of learning, autonomy, and, for many, genuine spiritual devotion. Within convent walls, women prayed, read, copied texts, composed music, studied scripture, and developed deep theological opinions. Some even wrote treatises or debated with male scholars, though always humbly, of course. Take Julian of Norwich, the 14th century anchoress who lived walled into a small room attached to a church. She spent decades in near isolation, writing, reflecting, and having mystical visions of Christ as both divine and maternal. Her Revelations of Divine Love is considered the first book in English known to be written by a woman. Then there were the Beguines. These women chose neither marriage nor convent life. Instead, they lived communally, prayed daily, cared for the sick, and supported themselves through weaving or teaching. They were deeply pious and fiercely independent. The church didn't quite know what to do with them. Some were praised, others condemned as heretics. Either way, they kept going. And speaking of mystical experiences, visions were a thing. Many women claimed divine visitations, seeing saints, hearing angels, feeling God's presence. Some fasted to the point of hallucination. Others were genuinely transformed by deep meditative states. In a world where women's words were often dismissed, a vision gave you authority, especially if it could be translated into sermons, art, or letters to the Pope. Of course, not all spiritual women were accepted. Heresy was the accusation that waited for anyone, man or woman, who veered too far from orthodoxy. One tragic example: Marguerite Porret, a French mystic who wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, a beautiful, deeply philosophical text about divine love and the soul's union with God. It was declared heretical. Marguerite was burned at the stake in 1310, not for magic or rebellion, but for writing theology that men found unsettling. But not all women of faith lived in cells or sang in choirs. Many lived ordinary lives and practiced folk Christianity blended with older traditions. They made pilgrimages, kissed relics, lit candles, and prayed to saints, with very specific job descriptions: Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Margaret for childbirth, Saint Catherine for clever girls who wanted to marry well. They wore tokens around their necks, whispered spells in Latin they didn't fully understand, wrote prayers into the margins of cookbooks. For them, religion was tactile, woven into clothing, hung over doorways, baked into bread. It was also political. Some women used spiritual status to influence kings. Others used it to create networks of support for the poor. Still others challenged authority outright, arguing that God spoke just as clearly to them as he did to any monk in a robe. And maybe he did. Because in a world where the body was seen as frail and sinful, and the soul as the only path to salvation, medieval women poured their pain, their power, and their hope into the divine. Some found peace, others found fire. But all of them, saints, sinners, and everyone in between, shaped the spiritual map of the Middle Ages in ways that still echo through cathedrals today. Let's end where all good bedtime stories do, not with a bang, but with a hush. Let the candle gutters flicker, the parchment rustle gently, and the stone walls breathe out their 1,000-year-old secrets. Because after all the saints and scolds, weavers and warriors, nuns and alewives, one thing becomes clear. Medieval women were not footnotes. They were chapters. Long, winding, complex ones, full of contradictions and clarity, strength and surrender. And though the world they lived in was so different from ours, no phones, no antibiotics, no rights, many of the rhythms feel hauntingly familiar. The feeling of being underestimated, of being watched, of being asked to shrink, of finding your own way anyway. Across the centuries, their stories echo with small acts of defiance. A nun writing under a male pseudonym, a peasant woman refusing to sell her cow, a girl sneaking a banned book into her apron. These weren't grand revolutions. They were daily, quiet choices to persist. We've walked through moss-lined birthing rooms and bustling market stalls. We've stood beside a noble woman negotiating land rights, while her husband blathered about falconry. We've watched someone pluck her hairline to look more fashionable, and someone else bleed into her shift and keep milking the cow anyway. We've seen how women found ways to express themselves through embroidery, prayer, song, and stories that weren't supposed to exist. We've seen how they loved cautiously, passionately, in secret, and with astonishing creativity. We've seen how they worked with their hands, their minds, their hearts, often unpaid and unrecognized. And maybe the most touching thing, we've seen how little of their lives was truly recorded and how much they mattered anyway. Because for every queen whose face graces a coin, there were thousands of women whose names are long gone, but whose labor built towns, whose songs comforted babies, whose stubbornness saved fields from famine, whose laughter surely echoed down crooked alleyways and faded cloisters alike. They lived in a world that was brutal and beautiful, full of danger and devotion, and they made it livable. So what do they still teach us? That history isn't always what's written in the books. It's in the margins, in the worn-out recipes and the prayers carved into beams. In the unmarked graves and the family stories passed down in whispers. That survival, in itself, is a kind of heroism, and that dignity doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it smells faintly of rosemary and goat. So tonight, as you drift off, know that you are part of a long, strange, beautiful chain of women. Mothers and daughters, lovers and rebels, thinkers and believers, all reaching backward and forward through time. And somewhere, deep in the folds of the past, one of them smiles softly and says, "Took you long enough to find us." Sleep well, traveler. History is never really silent. Thanks for joining me tonight on this gentle walk through the lives of medieval women, from queens and nuns to mothers, midwives, and witches with suspicious cats. If you enjoyed this sleepy dive into history's quiet corners, go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment about which story stood out to you. Your support helps keep these bedtime sagas going, and I always love seeing who's drifting off from where. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, the past isn't just dusty battles and royal drama. Sometimes, it's a woman in an apron, stirring soup with one hand, holding a baby with the other, and quietly reshaping the world. Good night.